Another foundational aspect of sociology, in addition to the sociological imagination, are our sociological paradigms. They are the core theories that we utilize to think through the way that social institutions interact, the way that human beings interact, the way that we understand society, and they are examples of how people have hypothesized that society works. And so I'm going to show you the names of the three of them quickly and then dig into each one a little bit more specifically. And so we've got social conflict, structural functionalism, and symbolic interactionism. So social conflict is our first one, and that is by a theorist named Karl Marx. Karl Marx is oftentimes the only person, if anybody's heard of someone outside of sociology, it's going to be Karl Marx. He did work in economics and other areas of academia. And so social conflict is assuming that there is an inherent power struggle in society. So you can think of the fact that kind of people are fighting for power. And so it's different groups working to control scarce resources. So scarce resources are not necessarily, a lot of times when we use the idea of resources, it's like natural resources like oil or water, things of that sort. But when we're talking about scarce resources, it can be money, it can be power, like we just said, is a power struggle. You know, honestly, as a modern day example of a scarce resource, and you think about people working to control, think about media, even specifically social media, and somebody working to control the scarce resource of attention. So if you think about someone who's a prominent figure in our society trying to utilize social media, you yourself, even, me, people are the scarce resource. Are people paying attention to you? Are people following along with what you're doing? And so when you're thinking about resources, it can be various areas, but you want to think about the fact that people are working to control them. People are working to have more and more, and some people are going to have more, and some people are not going to get a chance to have more. And so social conflict is talking about people having things and not having things and working to control, and how do they keep control. So when we're talking about power struggles and control, we're not focusing on puppies and rainbows, are we? We are focusing on a very negative and conflicted and ever-changing nature in society. And so ultimately what Karl Marx is saying is that the way that society functions in his theoretical point of view is that we are constantly working towards control of the resources that we feel that we need and how many we need and things of that sort. This is a macro theory, social conflict. And so I want to make sure that I point out what macro and micro mean in relation to theoretical usage. And so when we're saying social conflict is a macro theory, I teach at different classes, and one class I teach is sociology of the family. And so a lot of times when we start with sociological paradigms, I will have my students give examples of social conflict in relation to the family. And so a lot of times students will make the mistake because I'll tell them this is a macro theory, and they will then say, oh, well, an example of social conflict could be like two siblings fighting over a toy in a family. Well, that's a micro example. That's using it in a micro manner, this theory that is a macro theory. And so what I mean by that is you're just looking at two people interacting in a family. And when we look at macro theories and using them in a macro way, you need to actually take the family, and it's not just the family like a family, it's the family as an institution in our society, in our culture, in our country. And so how does the family as an institution interact as far as power struggles and scarce resources? So that would be looking at possibly the scarce resources that can happen in relation to the economy. Jobs could be scarce resources. Affordable housing could be scarce resources. And so that power struggle in society where the family needs to have their individuals and their family having jobs and having affordable housing to live in, and how does that interact? So that's what we mean by a macro theory. You're looking at large-scale societal phenomenon. It's not looking at small details in society. Another macro theory is structural functionalism. And so what structural functionalism is talking about is how society is structured. This was conceived of by a gentleman by the name of Talcott Parsons. And so structural functionalism is about societal institutions. And so I just mentioned two of them, the economy and the family. Other societal institutions, you're part of one right now, education, right? Our education system. You might have caught a cold recently and interacted with a medical institution, whether it was an urgent care, an emergency room. The government is a social institution. Religion is a social institution and faith-based communities. And so all of these societal institutions are contributing to society's functioning as a whole. They are all interacting. And that's what Talcott Parsons is saying is like his uh, theory about society. The reason that society exists is because we have social institutions interacting with each other. And so the key about them interacting with each other is they're all counting on each other. And so if one part of society, if one social institution is weak, it's going to be very hard for society as a whole to survive and to thrive. And so think about the education institution. If for some reason that were to really struggle and there were numerous issues coming up in the education institution that weakened it, that's going to weaken our economy. That's going to weaken our job force. That's going to weaken our government. That's going to even weaken the medical institution when we won't have medical professionals such as doctors and nurses being educated in the manner that they need to be. So thinking about how our society is counting on every single institution that we have to remain strong and to thrive so that all of our societal institutions can thrive together. The next theory is symbolic interactionism, and that is actually a little micro theory. That is looking at little tiny social phenomenon. This was conceived of by two gentlemen by the name of George Mead and Herbert Bloomer. And so what symbolic interactionism is arguing in relation to the root of society is that it comes from symbols. And so those symbols can be meaning, language, and thought. Right now, I am saying all of these words that you understand that symbolic language is what is holding us together. If I was doing this lecture in Italian, which I cannot, you necessarily, maybe you're fluent in Italian, and so you would understand that too. I would not. And so that idea of language can bring people together. The meaning of words can bring people together because sometimes words mean the same thing to a group of people, but not to another group of people. And then the way that our thoughts are structured is part of these little micro interactions that supposedly, as far as George Mead and Herbert Bloomer are saying, that you really can think of so many examples of thoughts and meaning and language in our society as kind of the basis of how we communicate and how we gather together as people. And so the key aspect of this is a lot of times these symbols and meanings change. So my examples for symbolic interactionism, it's a little bit unconventional, and quite honestly, it's already changed. It's not as prevalent as it was a few years ago. The word ratchet. Did you see that one coming? So let's think about what a ratchet actually is. It's a tool that I think tightens down bolts, right? So maybe you have, if you are in like a family home or have a, area of tools in your house, maybe you have a set of ratchets. But when you think about the way that words can change, we have used the word ratchet as a gendered insult, right? So I, as a mom to a young adult and as a person in my early 40s, I don't necessarily want to go around being like, I'm so ratchet, right? When we say that somebody's being ratchet, we oftentimes, I don't even know if I'm using it right, if you think about it, because I'm an old person and so you're way cooler than I am probably. We're saying that they are not a person that we want to be. And it's a gendered insult. We don't say that men necessarily are ratchet. That's a word that we use for women. And so that's an example of how symbols and meaning can change. A ratchet is a tool that tightens down bolts, and then all of a sudden now it's being used as a gendered insult. And this happens all the time and is fascinating to think about. Have you ever thought about when words actually change meaning? Like, who conceives of this and how does it catch on? So all the time we have language and symbols changing. A number sign, right? We call that a hashtag now. That wasn't a hashtag 10 years ago. We didn't even know what a hashtag was. What are going to be the changes in the future? What is something that we use right now as a word or a symbol or a meaning that will have an entirely different meaning in the future? And so that's kind of the way that society is held together, by the fact that we understand all these symbols, these languages, but to keep in mind that they are often changing.